Continuing here with this YouTube scenario of you posting a video, let's look at number 2. Find the average rate of change in the number of views from day 2 to day 5. So fill that in there, and then give a practical meaning of your answer in the context of your situation. Now, we already did one of these in our first video, but I just want to illustrate the calculations to be done and the use of delta notation here. So what are we looking at? We're looking at how these views here, n, the output variable, has changed from 2 to day 5 on an average basis. So there's the way we calculate them. You take the overall change in this, meaning the overall change in that variable divided by the overall change of that variable, the input, over day 2 to day 5. So here's the idea, and here's what the meaning. So the overall change in n is simply used by, or illustrated with that, and the overall change in d is illustrated by that symbol. And so what is the overall change? Well, to find change, if you remember, and what we did in our first video, is you need 2 subtractions. The overall change here in n, from here to here, the overall change, that's an increase there, and the idea here is to subtract that final guy minus the initial. And so that's 92 minus 12, and then the change in the input is from that to that, so that's 5 minus 2, and it's always the final value minus the initial. 5 minus 2, and so what do we get there? We get 80 minus 3, so that's views, that's days, so it changed overall, changed by 80 over 3 days, but when you actually do the division, 80 divided by 3, you should do that in your calculator, you're going to get approximately 26.7 with those units there, views per day. So here's the meaning. It's as if every day the number of views increased, positive, increased by 26.7. Every day in between that time period. So your book will emphasize delta notation. I just want to say a word about that here in a minute, and then give you a complete sentence for this. So delta notation. All right, here's our output values and our inputs. Now here's what delta notation says. Here's the formula. You take your initial output and your initial input, and you your final output, your initial output and your final output, and you subtract them, and then that's divided by your initial input subtracted from your final output. So the formula here for this right now, which gives us these values, would be 92 minus 12, so that's n2 minus n1, or n sub 2, sorry, minus n sub 1, and d sub 2 minus d sub 1. So this would be the formula using those variables here, but it's really those quantities. Again, this represents the final output value, that represents the initial output value, that represents the final input value, that represents the initial input value over the time frame that we're talking about, from day 2 to day 5. Okay, so I'm going to dictate to you the interpretation here, and it's really saying this. On average, it's as if the number of views increased by 26.7 each day from day 2 to day 5.